For quite a while, one phrase keeps popping up in conversations about World of Warcraft. The game has gone soft. Some players say Warcraft lost its edge years ago, others think it only happened recently, and some don't believe it ever happened at all. I put a poll out to my community and I asked a simple question. If World of Warcraft became soft, when did that happen? Some pointed to Cataclysm, Mists of Pandaria and Warlords of Draenor. Others felt the shift happened later, somewhere between Legion and Shadowlands. And some don't think Warcraft ever went soft. That made me curious, because when people say Warcraft lost its edge, they rarely mean the same thing. Is edge tragedy? Horror? Consequence? Or simply the feeling that the stakes really matter? And depending on your answer, soft can mean something completely different. And just to be clear, I'm not trying to change anybody's mind in this video. I think WoW has changed. I just think we don't all mean the same thing when we say soft, and that's worth unpacking. So in this video, I want to walk through Warcraft's history and look at the tone and themes of each era, not which expansions were the most fun to play, and not which ones had the worst systems, but the kind of stories Warcraft was telling, and how dark those stories actually were. This isn't a full retelling of Warcraft's story. I'm focusing on the tone each era projected, and the ideas those expansions were exploring. Because if Warcraft really did lose its edge, we should be able to see when it happened. There are chapters in the description if there's a section you're most interested in, but this is very much a video that builds as it goes. So let's start with the ice cream flavour so many players love.
Vanilla.
When World of Warcraft launched in 2004, Azeroth was a broken world. Fresh off the Burning Legion's invasion, the Night Elves had lost their immortality. Humans mourned Lordaeron's fall, and orcs were refugees building a new horde. The Alliance and Horde were fragile, with tensions erupting in places like Ashenvale and Hillsbrad. You will often hear people ask, what is the story of Vanilla? And Vanilla didn't really have one clean, overarching narrative the way later expansions would. It was a patchwork of zones and questlines, but many of those stories were surprisingly dark. Vanilla presented Azeroth as something stranger, a world shaped by consequences that had already happened, and were still unfolding quietly in the background. The Scourge lingered across the Eastern Kingdoms and the Plaguelands were still rotting under their influence. Stratholme still burned, and above it all floated Naxxramas, a reminder that the war against the undead hadn't ended. The iconic Scarlet Crusade began as protectors of the living, but paranoia turned them into executioners. Scarlet Monastery stood as a warning about what happens when certainty replaces compassion, and faith turns inward on itself. What always sticks out with me in Vanilla is even the small stories could be unsettling. Duskwood felt less like a battlefield and more like a place everyone else had quietly abandoned. A murdered tutor returned from the grave, a fallen knight wandering the cemetery, an embalmer stitching bodies together behind a farmhouse. These weren't crazy high-level stakes that you'd see in the modern game. These were local tragedies that nobody was coming to solve. Low-level questing in this zone was anything but cute. And that was part of what made Vanilla feel different. Azeroth didn't revolve around the player yet. You weren't arriving to save the world. You were arriving after it had already been changed. In Westfall, the Defias Brotherhood were former stonemasons, abandoned and unpaid after rebuilding Stormwind, left to starve in a kingdom that had already moved on. Their rebellion wasn't born of corruption or madness, it was just simply neglect. This wasn't fighting demons, you were cleaning up the consequences of political failure, poverty, and betrayal. Vanilla rarely framed these stories as moral reckonings. You were sent to deal with the problem, collect proof, and move on, whether the solution was just or not. This wasn't a story about high-stakes monsters or invasions, it was what happened when a kingdom stopped taking responsibility for its own people. Across the world, the same pattern repeated itself. Students were turned into necromancers in Scholomance. The Dark Iron Dwarves lived in chains beneath Blackrock Mountain. In Silithus, something older than memory stirred beneath the sand, hinting at horrors nobody fully understood yet. Death was everywhere, but it wasn't dramatic or heroic. It was ordinary. People died. Sometimes they came back wrong, sometimes they came back changed in ways there was no undoing. That was the Forsaken. Former humans living in the ruins of Lordaeron, surrounded by enemies, trying to build a future out of death and bitterness. Survival there already meant becoming something the rest of the world would fear. And we weren't there to save the world. It wasn't our job. Yet. And on the edge of the world, the Dark Portal pulsed. A silent promise that demons still waited beyond. In 2007, the Burning Crusade would throw wide the gates and drag us into a world literally torn apart. The Burning Crusade made good on the promise the Dark Portal had been holding over us. Step through, and you're in a world that's already dead. Hellfire Peninsula greets you with a torn, fell-scorched sky, and the Path of Glory, a road literally paved with the bones of slaughtered Draenei leading straight to the front lines. Outland, formerly Draenor, is a planet blown apart by fell magic. Floating islands under a ripped sky, demons everywhere, and survivors clinging to whatever scraps remain. The Draenei we meet are refugees of genocide. Many of them are the broken, twisted and abandoned after the Legion's corruption, living in misery or servitude. The Orcs are still paying for the blood curse, with entire clans transformed into Fell Orcs. And somewhere in this shattered world stands Illidan Stormrage, half hero and half tyrant, ruling from the Black Temple as he wages his own war against the Legion and slowly loses himself in the process. What's fascinating to me about Outland is how it contrasts from Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor. Vanilla felt like a wounded world, but Outland doesn't feel wounded, it feels finished. Like the war has already happened, and you're just walking through what's left of it. In places like Shadowmoon Valley, the sky itself still looks like it remembers the moment the world broke. Nagrand is one of my favourite zones, and it's beautiful. Almost comforting at first, but the longer you stay there, the more it feels like a memory that Outland wasn't supposed to keep. Outland almost feels like a realm for Warcraft exiles. The Broken, the Fell Orcs, the Blood Elves who followed Kael, Illidan himself. All of them living in the aftermath of decisions they couldn't undo. Survival in Outland often means servitude. The Broken live under their conquerors, Fell Orcs under demonic command, and even Illidan rules through control rather than restoration. The Draenei are survivors of the Burning Legion. Their entire history is shaped by it, and in Outland, you're meeting the Draenei after that story has already happened. And that feeling runs across the whole expansion. The Orcs aren't rising anymore, they're still paying for what they became. Illidan isn't saving Outland, he's trying to control it, forcing a solution onto a broken world. And the more he does that, the more he starts to resemble the very thing he's fighting. Kael'thas might be the clearest example of what Outland becomes for people like him. A prince who once stood beside the heroes of Warcraft ends up selling his people to the very force that destroyed them, trying to reclaim control in a world that had already taken everything from him. And even outside Outland, that same darkness lingers elsewhere. Karazhan, one of my all-time favourite raids, feels completely different from the rest of the expansion. It's quieter, stranger, haunting. A tower left behind after Medivh's madness, full of echoes, ghosts, and things that never quite make sense. And I think that's why the Burning Crusade still feels so harsh to players. It's not just that it's dark, it's that everything is already broken. It isn't subtle, it's excessive, demonic, and what a lot of people would have described back in the day as unapologetically heavy metal. In 2008, the war turned north, to Northrend, and this time, it wasn't demons at the gate, it was Arthas. Wrath of the Lich King is often remembered as the peak of World of Warcraft, as well as Warcraft's darkness, and for good reason. If the Burning Crusade was loud and apocalyptic, then Wrath was cold, methodical, and deeply personal to a lot of players. Arthas is obviously the centre of it, and many of us had watched him fall years earlier, and Wrath never lets you forget that. Wrath also marks a shift in how Warcraft tells its story. In Vanilla and the Burning Crusade, most of that darkness lived in the world itself, in quest text, in zones. Wrath starts bringing that storytelling to the surface, through cinematics, set-piece moments, and characters who are constantly present. And there's a lot of physical horror in Wrath that people sometimes forget. The Nerubian zones are full of stitched bodies and half-living things, buried cities turned into factories for the Scourge. The Vrykul raise their children through violence and abandonment, deciding who's worthy to live. Even just questing through Northrend, the world constantly reminds you that survival here comes at a cost. The Death Knight starting experience is maybe the clearest example of that. For the first time, you don't just fight the bad guys, you start as one. You're raised, controlled, sent to slaughter civilians and only barely break free. It's uncomfortable in a way that WoW hadn't done before, because it puts the guilt on you. And then of course there's the Wrathgate, a big heroic push, everyone finally standing together, and it just ends. Poisoned, Horde and Alliance wiped out in seconds. Bolvar doesn't get a triumphant ending, he gets burned alive and seemingly left for dead. The raid Ulduar also reminded us that the Scourge wasn't the only ancient horror stirring. Yogg-Saron's whispers made it clear, something older and more patient was watching. One of Wrath's darkest ideas is that Arthas isn't always trying to stop us. Sometimes he seems to be guiding us forward, letting us survive, letting us win, shaping us into the strongest possible servants for the moment he finally claims us. And this is why Wrath sticks with people. It wasn't subtle, but it wasn't just spectacle either. It took all the darkness Warcraft had been building up and it made it feel personal, like the cost of everything we'd already seen finally came due. Taken together, Vanilla, TBC and Wrath form the version of Warcraft that many players still carry with them. A world defined by plague, demons, obsession, and visible consequence. A lot of how we remember that era isn't about what was actually on screen, it's about how it felt at the time. We tend to remember the moments that hit hardest. A cinematic, a boss, a feeling, while quietly forgetting the long stretches that didn't. That doesn't make those memories false. They're real, they mattered, and nobody can ever take them away from you. But it does mean the story we tell ourselves about what Warcraft was is often simpler than the reality. And I include myself in this completely. Nostalgia has a way of smoothing things over. Over time, those powerful fragments harden into a clear narrative about how things used to be. And if we're not careful, it becomes very easy to start arguing with the past instead of analysing the present. And nostalgia isn't something people can simply be argued out of. This is the era that taught players what grit looked like in Warcraft. Loud, overt, unmistakable. And once players learn to recognise darkness that way, it's hard to stop looking for it in the same form. If something was dark, the game made sure you knew it. And it worked. For a long time. But after Wrath, something shifted. Not because Warcraft ran out of darkness, but because it started telling different kinds of stories. Moving into Cataclysm, Mists of Pandaria, and Warlords of Draenor, this is the period where many players left World of Warcraft, but it's also the period where the game arguably became more ambitious. Cataclysm, Mists and WoD each had strong, distinct thematic identities. Rather than abandoning darkness, Warcraft was experimenting with how it expressed it, through apocalypse, introspection, and raw militaristic fantasy. The problem wasn't a lack of tone, it was that the tone kept changing, and not everyone changed with it. At the time, it felt impossible to me that World of Warcraft could ever reach a high like Arthas again. Wrath of the Lich King felt definitive, a culmination of years of storytelling, obsession, and tragedy. Cataclysm didn't try to chase that same kind of villain. Instead, Blizzard did something far more radical. They reshaped the world itself. Deathwing's return wasn't symbolic or distant. In truth, some people had no idea who he was at the time. But it was physical, violent, and impossible to ignore. Continents were torn apart by fire and flood. Familiar zones were scarred, drowned, or burned. Azeroth itself became the battlefield, and we were living in the aftermath of a planetary trauma. Cataclysm would permanently alter the version of Azeroth players had grown attached to, and this was really divisive. Deathwing aside, the Twilight's Hammer were fanatics willingly surrendering their minds and bodies to old god corruption. Deepholm's questlines leaned into body horror and cosmic nihilism, with mortals losing their identity entirely in service of forces they barely understood. The Elemental Lords returned as manifestations of raw, indifferent destruction. Ragnaros reborn as a living inferno, Alakia's storms flailing the sky itself. Cataclysm's story was about consequence, about what happens when ancient powers are disturbed and the world pays the price. This expansion felt different because we weren't stopping an invasion from afar. This time, we were emergency responders, stitching Azeroth back together while haunted by the knowledge that much of this devastation was the result of long-forgotten choices. But Cataclysm does start to fracture tonally. In one zone, you're confronting cultists erasing minds and watching the world break apart. In another, you're following Harrison Jones through an extended Indiana Jones parody in Doom, complete with jokes, callbacks, and fourth wall winks. It swung hard between apocalypse and absurdity, sometimes within the same zone. For some players, that levity was welcome relief. For others, it shattered immersion. The issue wasn't that Warcraft suddenly became silly, it always has been, but that the tonal balance was no longer stable. But Cataclysm could still be devastatingly restrained when it wanted to be. In Stone Talon Mountains, Garrosh Hellscream executes one of his own commanders for bombing civilians. There's nothing fun here. No joke, no justification, just a hard line drawn, and a reminder that Warcraft still understood the weight of consequence. And yet, Cataclysm also marked the beginning of a new problem. Its ambition was enormous, but its tone was uneven. Grim devastation sat alongside exaggerated, almost cartoonish presentation in the leveling experience, creating tonal whiplash that left some players impressed by the scale, and others disconnected from the story it was trying to tell. Warcraft hadn't lost its edge, but it was starting to struggle with how to wield it. That struggle was most visible in how Cataclysm ended. Deathwing was framed as an extinction-level event, a force of nature tearing the world apart, but his defeat never quite released that pressure. The story promised apocalypse and the end of days, but the resolution fell flat. Azeroth survived, the threat was checked off, and the world moved on faster than the devastation suggested it should. It wasn't that Cataclysm lacked darkness, it was that the weight it built was difficult to land cleanly, a pattern that would become increasingly familiar in the years that followed. Mists of Pandaria is where a lot of players checked out before the story had even began. After a dragon tearing the world apart, the reveal was lush jade forests, bamboo villages, and a playable race inspired by martial arts folklore. For some players, it felt less like Warcraft and more like a tonal reset. It really was the Wind Waker of World of Warcraft. For many players, the verdict was instant. This isn't Warcraft. When I hear WoW is dead in 2026, I just laugh at this point. I've been hearing that since 2012. But on a serious note, this was without a shadow of a doubt the biggest shift WoW had had at the time, and it didn't help that the expansion launched alongside a familiar accusation, that Blizzard was pandering. Pun intended. That Pandaria existed to appeal to the Chinese market, that Warcraft was chasing a new audience at the expense of its identity. Whether that criticism was fair or not, it stuck, and for a lot of players, Mist was written off before anyone ever set foot in the zones. But Mists of Pandaria wasn't Warcraft going soft, it was Warcraft hiding its darkness in plain sight. Pandaria is a continent built on repression. Its central threat, the Shah, aren't monsters you can simply stab and move on from. They're manifestations of fear, doubt, despair, hatred and anger, emotional states that are made lethal. The more you indulge them, the stronger they become. The more you deny them, the deeper they rot beneath the surface. This wasn't cosmic horror or apocalyptic spectacle, this was psychological, intimate. The idea that unresolved trauma doesn't disappear, it festers. And over the course of the expansion, we watch that truth play out across every major character arc. Garrosh Hellscream would serve as one of the major villains of the expansion, and Pandaria is where the faction war reaches its most honest and most damning expression. It's so much different than banners and battlefield glory. It's about occupation, escalation, and atrocity. The bombing of Theramore isn't framed as a triumphant military victory, it's a moral rupture, a line crossed that can't be uncrossed. And from that moment on, the war stops being about survival and becomes about power. The Horde's campaign in Pandaria is openly imperialistic. Resources are stripped, dissent is crushed, the Divine Bell is weaponized. Pandaria doesn't corrupt Garrosh, but it does reveal him. The expansion keeps asking the same uncomfortable question. How much cruelty will you justify before you admit what you've become? And the land itself reflects this. The Mantid aren't villains in the traditional sense. They're a civilization built around an endless cycle of sacrifice and extinction. Survival demands brutality. There is no clean solution. Only the uneasy realization that some systems endure because they were never meant to be kind. The other major villain of the expansion would be Lei Shen, the Thunder King. He's a reminder of what raw authority looks like when stripped of pretense. He didn't inherit power, he seized it, violently, and bent a civilization to his will. His empire wasn't sustained by belief or destiny, but fear and domination. Pandaria doesn't romanticize him. It presents him as the logical endpoint of conquest unchecked by empathy. What makes Lei Shen especially important is that he wasn't a legacy character. He was created entirely for Mists of Pandaria, a brand new villain who didn't rely on nostalgia or existing mythology to carry him. For an expansion so oftenly dismissed as cute, Lei Shen stands as one of the most uncompromisingly brutal antagonists that Warcraft ever introduced. I think some people really miss some of the payoff and lessons in this expansion too. By the time Siege of Orgrimmar arrives, the expansion's thesis is clear. This isn't about Horde vs Alliance anymore, it's about accountability, about what happens when a system protects power over people. Garrosh isn't defeated as a raid boss first, he's indicted. The story has framed him as a tyrant long before we face off with him, and in doing so, Pandaria delivers one of Warcraft's sharpest moral reckonings. Mists of Pandaria doesn't lack darkness. It demands that you sit with it. Its horror lives in consequences, in emotional decay, in watching characters compromise themselves one decision at a time. If Cataclysm was about apocalypse, Pandaria was about introspection and aftermath. And for players willing to look past the aesthetic, past the jokes, the pandas, the softness of the surface, Mists of Pandaria stands as one of the most mature, disciplined, and thematically coherent stories Warcraft has ever told. A lot of that depth, though, lives in quest text and quieter moments. If you weren't engaging with those, it was easy for much of Pandaria's meaning to slip past unnoticed. This is something we'll come back to later in the video. What I will say is, you can definitely feel the lack of a unified vision post Mists of Pandaria, and I don't really subscribe to the idea that World of Warcraft's story was always bad. It was inconsistent at times, absolutely, but it had conviction, it had stakes, and it had people steering the ship who clearly cared about canon, consequence, and what this world meant. Whether you were upset with Mists, Warlords, Shadowlands, or whatever it may be, a lot of frustration has clearly set in, and that's understandable. But at some point, a lot of us face a choice. Try to meet the story where it is now, or quietly step back from the version we keep wishing it still was. Living in the space between love and resentment can hollow out the conversation entirely. And I think part of why these conversations get so heated is because a lot of us care deeply about this world. I care about it. And when something you've loved for years changes, that can feel personal. But caring doesn't have to mean constant war. It can also mean stepping back and trying to understand what changed. Warcraft didn't stop telling dark stories, but it definitely changed how it told them. Earlier expansions showed us worlds already collapsing. Modern ones ask what it means to live with what's left behind. If you're enjoying the video so far, please do consider subscribing. We still have a long way to go, and if you end up disagreeing with anything I say later in the video, you can always unsub. I won't take it personally, I swear. I love making long-form Warcraft videos like this, and I'd love to have you around. But more than anything, I'm really curious where you think this changed, if you think it changed at all. That being said, let's continue into Warlords of Draenor, an expansion that tried desperately to reclaim Warcraft's past, and in doing so, revealed just how fractured its present had become. Warlords of Draenor arrived with a level of hype I've never seen matched in World of Warcraft before. Still to this day. The trailer was electric. Garrosh Hellscream standing defiant, the Iron Horde revealed as an industrial war machine. It was loud, confident, and unapologetically Warcraft. For a moment, it felt like Blizzard had found a way to go back without going backward. And that was the promise of Warlords of Draenor. Nostalgia, but weaponized. The mechanics of how Garrosh escaped into the past aren't especially important here. What matters is that Warcraft chose to let him rewrite history rather than face the consequences of his actions. I mentioned earlier that Outland from TBC was formerly Draenor. In this expansion, we return to Draenor as it might have been. A world that hadn't yet shattered, clans that hadn't yet fallen, and at the centre of it all was Garrosh Hellscream, again. Garrosh wasn't seeking redemption. He wanted domination. An Iron Age empire built on conquest, industry, and racial supremacy. Orcs that would be united not by demon blood, but by fascistic strength. The Iron Horde isn't subtle. They're genocidal machines. Foundries belching smoke. War engines rolling over resistance. Entire races marked for extermination or subjugation. This is Warcraft's industrial horror, and unlike the Burning Legion, there's nothing cosmic or unknowable here. This is mortals choosing brutality because it works. But Warlords doesn't show us conquest, it shows us its cost. In Shadowmoon Valley, the Draenei aren't noble exiles yet. They're fragile, slowly realising that peace isn't coming. The Shadowmoon Exodus is one of WoW's quiet tragedies. Families are uprooted, cultures are erased. It's not flashy, but it is devastating. A reminder that most victims of war never get cinematics. At the same time, Gul'dan lurks in the margins, corrupting what Garrosh couldn't fully control. Fel seeps back in, warping clans into demons anyway, because power will always find a way in. The irony is brutal. The Iron Horde was meant to reject the Legion, but ends up mirroring it. Industry replaces Fel, the outcome is the same. Warlords of Draenor is obsessed with betrayal. Garrosh betrays history, Gul'dan betrays the clans betray each other, and eventually the timeline itself collapses under the weight of what's been done to it. And that's what makes Warlords so fascinating, man. And so frustrating. On paper, it's one of Warcraft's darkest expansions. It asks a terrifying question. What if the past didn't redeem itself? What if it doubled down? What if the monsters we remember fondly were always just one decision away from becoming something worse? But Warlords sadly never gets to finish that thought. The expansion collapses under its own ambition. Storylines are abandoned, characters disappear, entire arcs are cut. What begins as a brutal mirror to the Burning Crusade ends abruptly, funneling everything into another Legion setup. Gul'dan escapes into our timeline, the Legion looms, and Draenor is just left behind. It would be disingenuous not to acknowledge how Warlords actually felt to play. The long stretch in Hellfire Citadel, the selfie camera patch, the sense of cut content. Frustration hardened into resentment. It was the first time I took a break from WoW. Garrisons became the symbol of that anger, and when Warlords is remembered, it's remembered as a drought first and a story second. The experience eclipsed the intent. Warlords of Draenor didn't lack darkness. Far from it. It lacked follow-through. The moment most people remember from WoD, or certainly what comes to mind for me, is Thrall and Garrosh. That's the kind of teeth people mean. Blunt, physical, decisive. But WoD also proves something else. You can have the most hardcore or badass moment imaginable, and still leave an expansion feeling hollow if the wider story doesn't land. And in WoD's failure, it became a turning point. Players began to doubt whether the game could still land its own ideas. The hype had been real, but something had fractured between promise and payoff. That fracture would define everything that came next to WoW. Legion would prove to be Blizzard's most decisive response to failure. After Warlords of Draenor, Blizzard couldn't afford another fracture. Trust was gone. Patience was thin. For the first time, it felt like Warcraft itself was on the back foot, and so Legion feels different. This was Blizzard hitting the emergency button, pulling every lever at once. Artifact weapons, class fantasy front and centre. The Burning Legion returned, not as a slow burn, but as an existential threat from the opening moments. This was not subtle. It wasn't restrained. It was Warcraft reminding players exactly what it could still do, and exactly who it was still for. The Broken Shore opens with immediate loss. Varian Rin dies in front of us, Vol'jin soon after. Both of these were devastating losses, and they are holes that have never quite been filled. Artifact weapons, relics of Warcraft's history, are placed directly into the player's hands. This was going to be different than anything we'd played before. It was mythic escalation for our characters. We were always going to become heroes in Warcraft. It was inevitable. After you defeat villains such as the Lich King and Deathwing, how could you not be? But Legion is the moment where the transformation becomes official. We're no longer adventurers navigating a broken world. We are wielders of legendary weapons, commanders of class halls, and that's exciting, but it also changes Warcraft's texture. When the story calls you the hero or the champion long enough, the world stops feeling bigger than you. It stops feeling like you're surviving it and starts feeling like you're managing it. Legion really turned our power levels up to 11. By the time we eventually reach Argus, a literal titan, the scale of Warcraft has become almost absurd, and that absurdity is going to matter. Legion was more than just proof that World of Warcraft could be good again. It was about closure. Some might tell you that Warcraft 3's story is about Arthas, and that isn't true. Arthas is only one piece of a much larger war. The Burning Legion had haunted Warcraft since Warcraft 3. From Warcraft 3 to the Burning Crusade, Sargeras was the shadow behind everything. Legion wasn't about introducing a new threat, it was finishing the oldest one. And what is the hunt without the hunter? Illidan's return is one of Legion's boldest moves. Presumed dead after the Burning Crusade, his body preserved, but his story unfinished. When Gul'dan attempts to use him as a vessel for Sargeras, and when Xera later tries to forcibly redeem him in the light, Illidan refuses both. He rejects prophecy, he rejects destiny, he rejects the idea that anyone, demon or Naru, gets to decide who he becomes. This is widely regarded as one of the best cutscenes in World of Warcraft. It's bombastic, brutal, and brilliant. But more than that, it's Warcraft interrogating faith, control, and cosmic authority at the highest level. These kind of cosmic stakes aren't for everybody, but Legion still knew how to make the story feel personal and tragic. Ysera's death in Val-Shirar is one of the expansion's most painful moments. It reminded players that even in Warcraft's most bombastic era, loss could still feel personal. And for some of us, the loss landed even earlier. Tyrion Fordring's death at the Broken Shore hit especially hard if you played a paladin. The man who carried the Ashbringer and stood against the Lich King was suddenly gone, and that was really hard to take. But Legion's darkness wasn't only found in heroic sacrifice or world-ending spectacle. Sometimes it showed up in much quieter places, and nowhere is that clearer than Suramar. You walk into this city that looks perfect on the surface, elegant, cultured, refined, and then you start to realise that it's rotting from the inside. The Nightfallen aren't villains, they're addicts, cut off from the Nightwell, literally withering in the streets, and the people at the top have survived by staying loyal. Grand Magistrix Elasan rules knowing that if people resist her, they starve. Gul'dan doesn't conquer Suramar by burning it down. He does exactly what you would expect him to do. He feeds it, he offers power, he gives the elite exactly what they want and lets the whole system decay from within. Going to Argus felt very reminiscent of heading into Outland for the first time. It's already dead. The sky's wrong, the ground's wrong, everything feels industrial and exhausted. By the time we're fighting a literal titan, you kind of realise, this is as big as it gets. Once you kill a titan, where do you even go from there? There isn't a bigger threat left to escalate toward, only new ways to reframe the conflict. Legion feels final in a way that very few expansions ever have, because it closes a chapter that began before World of Warcraft even existed. And when something that big ends, it leaves a weird silence behind. The sense that Warcraft has finally reached the top of its own escalation curve. But the silence obviously doesn't last as Sargeras stabs the planet. Azeroth itself is wounded, bleeding what is known as Azerite, and suddenly the next expansion's conflict has pressure. If there's a moment that proves WoW hadn't gone soft, it's that. Legion's victory isn't clean. The world itself is left bleeding, and everything that follows is infected by it. And frustratingly, over time, even that moment became a meme.
There's a cinematic, and Sargeras, as you know, stabbed the earth with a sword, and it's been there for quite a while, and I'm not really sure like where are things going with that.
Wait, what? What sword?
Okay, all right.
It all comes back to follow through, and the game struggled to let the consequence linger or really shape what came next. Azerite ends up feeling like a footnote in BFA's story compared to everything else that goes on. When the world moves on too quickly from something that massive, the impact fades, even if the event itself was anything but soft. And that left Warcraft in a strange position. The world is wounded, but instead of sitting with that injury, the story pivots immediately. Azerite should have felt like a world-changing discovery. Instead, it quickly became background noise to a conflict that felt a lot more personal to players. Blizzard's answer was to resume the faction war, because after you've killed a titan, the only thing that still feels personal is each other. I would argue that Legion, Battle for Azeroth, and Shadowlands are actually some of the darkest expansions in WoW's history, at least on paper, but their darkness often landed in a way that felt exhausting rather than truly impactful. Tone, pacing, presentation, and system fatigue all collide, and for a lot of players, that combination feels like softness. Battle for Azeroth and Shadowlands are the clearest examples of that disconnect, because these expansions were dark in two ways. Not just in their stories, but in how they felt to play. Exhausting, joyless, and relentless. That experience doesn't erase their themes, but it can complicate how players might remember them. And that's not a moral failing on the player's part. It's just what happens when a game asks you to sprint emotionally for years. The burning of Teldrassil may be one of the most shocking events in Warcraft's history. It isn't framed as a battlefield victory. It isn't a familiar clash of armies. It's an extinction event. Civilians trapped, a world tree set ablaze, night elves watching their home burn while the sky turns orange. For a lot of players, this was the moment that snapped something, and this runs a bit deeper than just the event itself. It's not just about what happened, tragic as it was, but because of who it implicated. For Horde players especially, the burning of Teldrassil extended beyond a cutscene. This was an identity crisis. The expansion didn't frame the Horde as misunderstood, it framed them as aggressors, as conquerors, as executioners. Being associated with that, even fictionally, made some players deeply uncomfortable, and that discomfort wasn't accidental. Battle for Azeroth deliberately stripped away the romanticism of faction pride, and it asked a brutal question. What if your banner isn't righteous? If vanilla romanticized faction tension, if Wrath weaponized unity against a greater evil, BFA did something much harsher. It took the fantasy so many loved of faction pride and put it on trial. It's one thing to watch your faction commit an atrocity, it's another to watch one of its most respected veterans refuse to defend it. Varrock Saurfang isn't a radical, he isn't a rebel by nature, he's old Horde. He believes in honour, in strength, in facing your enemy head on. And when Teldrassil burns, you can see it on his face. This isn't victory, it's shame. A father who lost his son at the Wrathgates, a warrior who watched the Horde fall once before, and now he's watching it happen again. The Alliance doesn't try to negotiate, they go straight for the Undercity. The Undercity was formerly Lordaeron, it's the old human capital, Arthas' homeland. A place that's already fallen once. At Lordaeron, Saurfang stays behind. He gives himself up. He doesn't fight for Sylvanas' vision. He simply refuses to keep pretending this is honour. When Anduin confronts him in the Stockades, the conversation isn't about victory, it's about legacy, about cycles, about whether the Horde can survive becoming the thing it once swore to destroy. Saurfang isn't fighting the Alliance anymore. He's fighting the version of the Horde that Sylvanas represents. And that's what makes BFA so uncomfortable. It isn't just a war story, it's a civil war over identity. Later in the expansion, when Saurfang challenges Sylvanas to Mat-Garah, he knows he can't win, but he does it anyway. For Azeroth. Not for the Horde, for the world. And when Sylvanas calls the Horde nothing, that's the moment the illusion finally collapses. The war wasn't about survival, it was about power. The Horde was forced to confront what it had become. The Alliance, on the other hand, was forced to confront something it had never truly resolved. Kultiras doesn't welcome Jaina home as a hero. She's a traitor. This is the daughter who let her father die. Back in Warcraft 3, Jaina made a choice that defined her. When her father, Dalen Proudmoore, tried to exterminate the orcs in Kalimdor, she refused to stand with him. She chose peace over blood, and he died for it. BFA pulls that long-forgotten thread right back into the present. Kultiras doesn't care whether Jaina was morally right. They care that their Lord Admiral sailed away and never came home. Jaina's story here isn't about the Horde. It isn't even really about the war. It's about guilt. Because even if she knows she made the right decision back then, there's still that voice asking whether it was worth it, whether peace justified the cost, whether she could have done something differently. And that's an awful place to live. She chose mercy over vengeance, and it didn't give her closure. It gave her exile, and BFA doesn't let her outrun that. She's dragged into a space where every ghost she's been carrying is waiting. Her father, Arthas, Theramore, Varian. Decisions that cost lives, and choices that still echo. Only after she breaks does her mother reach her and tells her something she's never been able to tell herself, that she can stop punishing herself for it, to forgive her father and, importantly, forgive herself. And that's not softness, man. That's grief. But BFA doesn't stay grounded for long. Because as much as Blizzard said this was about the faction war, everyone knew something else was waiting in the background. Queen Azshara had been looming over Warcraft for years. Since Warcraft 3. Since the Well of Eternity. She wasn't some new antagonist pulled out of nowhere. She was unfinished business. And that's the strange contradiction of Battle for Azeroth. At its best, it's intimate. Shame, grief, legacy, cycles. But the expansion can't stay in that emotional space because it's also trying to pay off years of cosmic build-up at the same time. And that's where things start to blur, because just as the faction war reaches its ugliest honesty, the story pivots into something much bigger. For lots of players, including myself, Azshara was more than just a patch boss. She represented something Warcraft has always leaned into. That pull toward power, and the sense that some characters think they're destined for it. Azshara doesn't really end the faction conflict, she just interrupts it. The war that started with all that fire and anger suddenly becomes background noise to something older and much more cosmic. For years, N'Zoth was whispered about as the Patient One, the Manipulator, the last old god still out there scheming. When Ny'alotha finally opens, it should feel like the culmination of Warcraft's cosmic horror, but it arrives, resolves, and disappears almost as quickly as it appears. And for many players, that pacing undercut the weight it had spent years building. And through all of BFA, the burning, the shame, the ocean, the Black Empire, one figure remains at the centre of it all, and that is Sylvanas Windrunner. A character who, for years, embodied defiance, tragedy, and ruthless survival, and who, as Warchief of the Horde, now carries the full weight of its actions. Sylvanas was a major breaking point in BFA. She'd always walked a dangerous line, ruthless but understandable. In BFA, that line completely disappears. And when a character shifts that dramatically, especially one so closely tied to faction identity, the reaction isn't quiet, it's visceral. Sylvanas goes on to become a serious fracture point in the narrative. For some players, she represents everything Warcraft used to be: ruthless, unapologetic, willing to go too far. For others, she represents a story that lost its centre, a character pushed so far into extremity that the emotional logic just stopped holding. And this divide is really important, because when a story's central figure no longer carries a shared meaning for the audience, every moment that follows will land differently depending on where you stand. Some players saw tragedy, some saw character assassination, some simply felt exhausted. And when an audience stops reacting together, even the darkest storylines can start to feel strangely weightless, because the emotional through line holding them together has begun to splinter. I believe that to be the paradox of Battle for Azeroth. It isn't a soft expansion. If anything, it may be the bleakest Warcraft has ever been. But its darkness rarely has time to settle before the story moves again. From war, to Azshara, to N'Zoth, to Sylvanas' departure, each escalation arriving before the last one has fully landed. I've always been of the belief that BFA was just overloaded narratively, and I think this could have genuinely been Blizzard's first 3-part saga. I think they could have began with the faction conflict, which bled into a Nazjatar-themed expansion with Azshara at the forefront, and finally a Black Empire expansion culminating with N'Zoth and Ny'alotha. I think they had something massive here, and containing it all inside BFA was just too much. For me, anyway. I understand not everybody will agree with that opinion, and that's fine, but I just felt they had a lot more to give. It's also worth acknowledging something I mentioned earlier that complicates how BFA is remembered. Players don't experience expansions purely as stories. They experience them as games first. Systems, progression loops, daily requirements, and pacing shape how an expansion feels moment to moment. And if that experience feels frustrating, exhausting, or unrewarding, it inevitably colours how the story attached to it is remembered too. BFA asked a lot from its players. Azerite systems, reputations, borrowed power grinds, and constant resets created a sense of forward momentum that rarely felt satisfying. When the act of playing becomes tiring, even genuinely heavy story beats can struggle to land the way they're intended to. The themes are there, but they don't always resonate as strongly when the player's already worn down. That doesn't invalidate the frustration people felt, but it does blur the line between tone and experience, and it left the game in a strange emotional place by the time the next expansion approached. When Shadowlands was announced, curiosity was still there. The idea of the afterlife, seeing familiar faces again, exploring somewhere completely new, it was intriguing. But Shadowlands wasn't just a new continent like we'd seen in previous expansions. It was Warcraft making a claim about what death is. And the moment you do that, every tragedy you've told before gets pulled into the argument. And when an audience is already a little worn down, even a story about death itself can struggle to land the way it should. Shadowlands is where Warcraft did something incredibly risky. It tried to explain death. And once you start explaining death, it's beyond telling a new story. You're rewriting the emotional rules of the entire setting. By this point, frustration with Warcraft's storytelling was already high. BFA had left many players emotionally exhausted, and trust in the narrative was fragile. So when Shadowlands arrived and began reinterpreting some of Warcraft's most personal tragedies through a cosmic lens, many players weren't approaching it with the same curiosity they had when it was first announced. Shadowlands didn't just fail on its own. It landed on an already exhausted audience, and unlike earlier Dark expansions, Shadowlands rarely gave players relief. The systems were demanding, the tone was relentless, and even moments meant to feel hopeful were framed inside a story about cosmic inevitability and loss of agency. When an expansion feels oppressive to play as well as to watch, its darkness stops feeling dramatic and starts feeling heavy. What exhausts people now too isn't just that bad moments happened, it's the sense that there was no real reckoning with them, no acknowledgement, no course correction, just a quiet nudge forward hoping the next thing would land better than the last. That's where frustration hardens, and Shadowlands struggled to outrun its own legacy. Shadowlands would hurt more than other missteps because its consequences didn't stay contained. It rewrote the rules of death, belief, and consequence across the entire setting, and then asked players to simply accept that shift and move on. The problem with the Jailer isn't that Warcraft's past was expanded. Warcraft has revised its lore before, the Burning Crusade being a clear example of that. The problem with Zovaal is that he retroactively claims ownership over Warcraft's most personal tragedies. Arthas Menethal's fall didn't need to be folded into a larger cosmic design. The Burning Legion already provided the backdrop. Ner'zhul didn't need a hidden architect behind his choices. Those stories worked because they were rooted in agency, temptation, and consequence. Shadowlands didn't deepen that darkness, it just explained it away, and in doing so, Zovaal's existence undermines several of Warcraft's past antagonists. Sylvanas, Kel'Thuzad, and Ner'zhul are all reframed as servants of the Jailer, which diminishes their agency and it cheapens their stories. But even if you strip the Jailer out entirely, Shadowlands still has something to say, and it's arguably darker than people give it credit for. For some players, it didn't just feel dark or hollow, it felt alien. The shift towards cosmic forces, abstract hierarchies, and universe-spanning stakes pushed Warcraft into a space that felt closer to a cosmic fantasy story than the grounded mythic tone many players associated with Warcraft. That kind of storytelling isn't inherently wrong, but it is a matter of taste, and for some, it just didn't feel like Warcraft anymore. The real question Shadowlands asks is simpler and much bigger. What does it believe death should look like? Shadowlands answers that through the Covenants. Whilst as players we chose our covenants, in the lore these afterlives aren't chosen. Souls are stored, judged by the Arbiter, and sent where they're deemed most useful. What mattered to you in life doesn't grant you agency in death, it assigns you a function. Bastion is the calmest example, and the most revealing. On the surface, it looks like heaven. Clean skies, serene music, angelic figures guiding souls gently onward. But the Kyrian teach that letting go isn't just encouraged, it's required. Peace doesn't come from understanding your life, it comes from forgetting it. In Bastion, death isn't a reckoning or a continuation, it's erasure presented as serenity. Maldraxxus offers a harsher answer. Death as continued function. You fight, you fall, you're reforged, and you're sent back in again. Failure isn't tragic over there, it's recyclable. Ardenweald offers something that initially feels gentler, a place of rest, of renewal, of quiet preservation. Spirits sleep beneath the trees, waiting for the chance to return to the cycle of life. But even here, peace is conditional. When anima runs dry, not every soul can be saved. Some must be allowed to fade so that others can return. In Ardenweald, death isn't cruel in an overt way, it's selective. Existence becomes a question of resource and priority. Which lives are preserved? Which are allowed to disappear so that something else can continue? It's a softer kind of tragedy, but a tragedy nonetheless. A reminder that even in the most beautiful corner of the afterlife, survival is never guaranteed. And finally Revendreth, which offers a harsher interpretation of redemption. Here, souls are not comforted or restored, they're processed. Sinstones catalogue every failure, every cruelty, every regret. Redemption isn't granted through reflection alone, but through suffering, extracted, measured, and if necessary, prolonged. Revendreth treats morality almost like a resource to be harvested. Atonement must be proven, guilt must be drained. And for those who fail to atone, there's always the threat of being cast somewhere worse. Forgiveness becomes transactional, and redemption has a cost. And when a soul can't be erased, repurposed, sacrificed, or corrected, what's left is the maw. Not hell in a moral sense, but where meaning finally collapses. There's no lesson, no judgment, no transformation, just endless suffering, enforced by a system that stopped pretending it serves a purpose. You might be wondering why I've gone through all the covenants, and there are reasons for that. I think it's important to explain the themes of what they represented, rather than players blindly remembering them because it was the meta for their class. But more importantly, what I find interesting about Shadowlands and the Covenant is that it doesn't ask who you were in life, it asks what you can be turned into in death. None of these afterlives are really appealing or peaceful. Every Covenant asks you to surrender something of yourself, your memories, your identity, your purpose in life. The system doesn't preserve who you were, it reshapes you into what the Shadowlands needs. And I don't think those themes are really talked about enough, probably because of the expansion's reputation. Shadowlands was by far the most difficult period in Warcraft's history, and it's often remembered for oppressive gameplay, poor systems, uneven storytelling, and an underdeveloped villain. Criticisms that are absolutely valid, but that failure doesn't mean it lacked darkness. The horror was there, it just manifested differently. Through inevitability, loss of agency, and suffering without resolution, rather than mythic tragedy or grand spectacle. The story of Shadowlands is confusing and incomplete, but its themes were anything but light. It made death smaller, closer, and explainable, and in doing so, stripped it of mystery. Exploring the afterlife is always risky. Once death is turned into a system, it can never feel unknowable again. After attempting to map the machinery of death itself, Warcraft would again pivot. Dragonflight wasn't about the architecture of the cosmos, it was about inheritance, about leaders who failed, children growing up in the shadow of those failures, and a world trying to decide what kind of future it actually wanted. That lingering hollowness didn't vanish when Shadowlands ended. Dragonflight didn't try to answer it directly. Instead, it shifted tone, away from cosmic abstraction and towards something more intimate and more grounded. Dragonflight is often remembered as World of Warcraft's cosy, hopeful reset. Bright skies, wholesome Tuskar, and a tone that leans more towards exploration and rebuilding than death and apocalypse. After the exhaustion of Shadowlands, that shift felt deliberate, almost necessary. But if you dig into the lore, there's a surprisingly dark underbelly beneath that bright surface. A race of lab-built soldiers abandoned by their creator. A secret underground facility filled with failed experiments and Shadowflame corruption. Ancient siblings betrayed, imprisoned, and left to rot for millennia. Dragonflight might look gentle, but its core stories are pretty bleak. If you slow down and actually read the quest text, you'll find themes that are ugly, tragic, and at times even body horror. If you skip the quest text, you probably missed it. And that's not an insult, it's just how the game is structured. One of Dragonflight's biggest challenges is that it broke the visual language Warcraft had trained players to read for nearly 18 years. For most of WoW's history, darkness was obvious. It was communicated through colour palettes, music, and zone design. Plague, skulls, fire, and corrupted skies told you immediately what kind of story you were in. Dragonflight doesn't do that, and as a result, many players conflate visual tone with narrative severity. That disconnect isn't really anyone's fault, it's just a side effect of how World of Warcraft taught us to read its world. On the surface, Dragonflight presents itself as optimistic and inclusive. The marketing leaned heavily on flight and discovery. The narrative focuses on rebuilding the Dragonflights, helping characters find new identities, and repairing old wounds. Emberthor's journey is about self-definition after abandonment. Rathian and Sibelian's rivalry is framed through banter rather than hostility. Dragonflight leans into emotional openness and a more inclusive tone, one that feels intentionally comforting after Shadowlands' relentless bleakness. And the pacing reflects this. Open-world exploration, player choice, and a generally gentler rhythm compared to Legion or Shadowlands. But underneath that surface is where the real edge lives. The Drakthir are not a natural people. They were manufactured in Neltharion's laboratory long before his full descent into Deathwing. Faced with the Primal Incarnates, the Aspects needed an army that was adaptable, versatile, and absolutely loyal. Dragons were too independent, so Neltharion turned to forbidden biomagical engineering in Aberrus, fusing the essence of all 5 Dragonflights with mortal adaptability through countless brutal experiments. That's why the Drakthir can wield red, blue, green, bronze, and black magic at once, and why their creation was anything but natural. This was forced evolution, grotesque experimentation, and weaponized biomagical engineering carried out by an Aspect who believed the ends justified any means. The Drakthir were also controlled as well as created. Neltharion controlled them through the Oathbinder, a gauntlet that allowed him to override their will entirely. Functionally, it's not far removed from Order 66 in Star Wars, obedience hard-coded into living beings waiting to be activated. Neltharion didn't want soldiers who could disobey, he wanted weapons that obeyed. When the war ended and Neltharion's control over them began to fail, he sealed the Dracthyr away in stasis pods on the Forbidden Reach, rather than risk rebellion. They wake up in Dragonflight confused, grieving, and forced to build an identity from scratch, only to find out that their creator died a world-destroying monster who never loved them. That same horror continues in the raid Aberrus the Shadowed Crucible, Neltharion's secret lab buried beneath the Obsidian Citadel. Aberrus is pure Frankenstein fantasy. Failed hybrids, flesh crafting, shadow flame corruption, and echoes of Deathwing's descent into madness. The raid's final boss, Sarkareth, is a tragic Dracthyr rebel who seeks to reclaim Neltharion's legacy, believing strength and obedience were the Dracthyr's true purpose, only to be consumed by that same legacy, dying a monster just as Neltharion once did. Elsewhere, the supposedly cozy Primalist War is built on betrayal and ancient cruelty. Raszageth spends millennia imprisoned by the dragon aspect and dies unrepentant, still raging against her captivity and the world that bound her. Virinov is left torn between rage and reconciliation. The Titan Keeper Tyr, once a heroic shaper of Azeroth, was murdered by his ally Loken, and in Dragonflight we literally piece his legacy back together from fragments. The Black Dragonflight storyline is pure generational trauma. Rathian, Sibelian and Abyssian all grappling with the legacy of their father and the fear of becoming him. Dragonflight doesn't abandon Warcraft's traditional corruption arcs entirely. Shadowflame, the volatile fusion of elemental fire and void corruption, runs through Aberrus and Farak's story alike. Farak is corruption in its most familiar form, power embraced without restraint, identity consumed by appetite. He burns, mutates and destroys because he can. Even moments like the burning of Loam, which should feel horrific on paper, are framed with a lighter visual touch. The destruction is real, but the presentation is softened, reinforcing the same disconnect Dragonflight struggles with throughout. The darkness is present, but it rarely lingers. So why does all of this feel soft to so many players? If I was going to guess, I'd say it's likely because none of it delivered with the heavy metal spectacle Warcraft once relied on. There's no Arthas looming over the frozen throne, no Illidan roaring, "You are not prepared!" No Wrathgate-styled cinematic designed to sear itself into collective memory. The horror here is quieter. Genetic slavery, betrayal, loss of autonomy, identity crisis. For some players, the image of Dragonflight that stuck wasn't Aberrus or the Dracthyr or the generational trauma running through the Dragonflights. It was moments like Kaligos speaking about the power of friendship, or the expansion's more visible emphasis on emotional openness and representation. Those moments became shorthand for the entire expansion in some corners of the community, a quick way to frame Dragonflight as lighter, safer, or less serious than what came before. And I'm certainly not defending the Kaligos cinematic, as I didn't particularly like it either, but it does serve as a catch-all whenever the expansion is brought up. And when a handful of highly visible scenes become the lens through which everything else is judged, it's easy for the darker material sitting just beneath the surface to be overlooked entirely. And that's part of Dragonflight's dilemma. Its most visible moments are gentle, its darkest ones are often quiet. And this is where perception and reality start to diverge. Some players will say that Legion, BFA, or Shadowlands felt higher stakes, and that's absolutely true. Legion gave us the Burning Legion's final invasion. BFA brought long-awaited confrontations with Azshara and N'Zoth. And yes, even Zoval's depraved attempt to rewrite reality. But there's a reason Dragonflight had to be what it was. Warcraft's threats had escalated to Marvel-scale absurdity. I mentioned in the Legion section about killing Argus. In my opinion, that's when the narrative ceiling was completely shattered. You can't meaningfully go back after that. Killing 8 gnolls or collecting flowers doesn't erase the fact that we've already slain gods. Dragonflight responded by deliberately lowering the scale, but not the weight. Its horror is smaller, more personal, and more internal. It's about being created as a weapon, about betrayal by family, about addiction, control, and abandonment. It's a tonal shift, not an absence of edge. Dragonflight asks something different of its audience, not just to watch events unfold, but to slow down and inhabit them, to imagine what it means to wake up as a weapon, to inherit a legacy you never chose, or to live with betrayal that never gets a clean resolution. It's also worth acknowledging that Dragonflight was never going to be judged on its own terms. After Shadowlands, a lot of players weren't coming into this expansion curious, open-minded, or even coming back at all. Some players who did were tired, distrustful, and already one foot out the door. When an audience has been burned that badly, even genuine course correction can look like window dressing. Dragonflight had to do so much more than tell a new story. It had to rebuild trust. It had to remind players why this world mattered in the first place, and that's a much harder task than simply making something darker again. The War Within was the first expansion I didn't play on launch, and that says a lot about what Shadowlands did to many players' relationship with this world. I wasn't coming back excited, I was coming back guarded. I'd stepped away from the game for the longest period in my life, and when I briefly returned during Dragonflight, it was more out of comfort than excitement. World of Warcraft had always been a constant for me, something familiar to return to when life felt uncertain. But even then, my head was still in Shadowlands. I wasn't ready to just move forward like nothing had happened, and that emotional hangover shaped how I experienced everything that followed. I don't blame Dragonflight. If anything, I regret robbing myself of that experience. But after an hour of The War Within, I felt something Dragonflight rarely gave me. Texture, somber music over rubble, a story that lingers, cutscenes that actually breathe. It didn't feel like Warcraft was trying to convince me it mattered, it just felt like Warcraft again. The War Within isn't defined by a single figure, it's defined by its themes, inheritance, memory, buried trauma, and a world literally built on unresolved wounds. I do think The War Within and the World Soul Saga is the first time in a long time where there's a genuine attempt to recenter things, which is why the mood feels so conflicted. Cautious optimism weighed down by years of distrust. Whilst The War Within felt quite old school to me, featuring the Arathi and the Nerubians, it doesn't return to Warcraft's older heavy metal style of darkness. It trades spectacle for something more internal, psychological, generational, and deeply personal. Anduin is no longer framed as a young king rising towards greatness. He's a man trying to reconnect with a part of himself that feels lost. After being dominated and used as a weapon in Shadowlands and completely absent in Dragonflight, he doesn't return as a triumphant leader. He returns fractured, uncertain, and searching. Warcraft has always told stories about sacrifice and death. What it's less comfortable with, and what The War Within leans into, is survival after those things. That kind of psychological weight isn't loud or spectacular, but it's heavy in a different kind of way, and it shows how Warcraft's darkness has shifted from spectacle to aftermath. It's not the fall of a hero, it's the story of someone learning how to live with what happened to him. And that kind of resilience is something most of us understand in one way or another. Picking yourself up, carrying on, finding a way forward, even when it's difficult. A questline that always sits with me in The War Within is the Earthen story with Corgrin on the Isle of Dawn. This chain of quests was the first time WoW had ever made me cry, because it hit very close to home. He's losing pieces of himself, memories slipping, purpose eroding, watching someone you care about still be there but not fully present anymore, and knowing there's no heroic solution. That slow, helpless grief is something anyone who's lived around dementia or Alzheimer's will recognise immediately. Warcraft has told stories about death and sacrifice for decades, but this was different. This was about decline, about loving someone through loss that doesn't arrive all at once, but in fragments. And I understand why this kind of storytelling doesn't land for everyone. Some players come to Warcraft for myth and metaphor, for gods, monsters, dragons, and importantly, distance. World of Warcraft, and gaming more broadly, is often described as an escape. There's comfort in that scale. Personal suffering, especially when it mirrors real life, doesn't feel like escapism. It feels invasive. But that doesn't make it lighter. If anything, it makes it heavier, just in a way that's harder to process. The War Within asks players to sit with discomfort instead of overcoming it, and that's a very different emotional contract than Warcraft used to offer. That shift towards more intimate storytelling doesn't mean Warcraft has abandoned large-scale loss entirely. The destruction of Dalaran is a reminder of that. A city that's existed since Warcraft 2, a symbol of continuity and magical power, reduced to rubble at the very start of an expansion. But even here, the focus isn't just about the fall, it's about aftermath, on what happens to the people who survive when somewhere familiar is suddenly gone. Earlier Warcraft often framed destruction as a dramatic endpoint. A city falls, a hero dies, a battle is won or lost. The War Within is more interested in what comes after that. Who's still left standing? What do they carry forward? And how do they live with it? Xal'atath reflects that same tonal shift. She's patient, observant, almost conversational, a villain defined less by domination and more by influence. Earlier Warcraft loved loud antagonists. Xal'atath represents something quieter, manipulation, inevitability, erosion rather than invasion. And that kind of threat can feel less dramatic moment to moment, even when the implications are just as severe. Some of the reaction to Xal'atath comes from pacing rather than characterization. Earlier expansions usually introduced a villain and resolved them within the same release cycle. Arthas, Deathwing, Illidan, the Jailer, they all followed that structure. Xal'atath doesn't. Her story clearly isn't meant to end here. Warcraft is treating her less like a raid boss and more like a long-form antagonist, and players aren't entirely used to that yet. Xal'atath feels different, not because she's underdeveloped, but because Warcraft is positioning her as something that isn't finished yet. When a character's arc is still unfolding, it can register as absence rather than setup. Like much of the War Within, the conflict isn't just external, it's inherited, and that emphasis on generational burden rather than simple victory reinforces how Warcraft's darkness has shifted from grand conflict to consequence. And that same shift is visible in the heroes themselves. Some players have reacted strongly to the way certain characters are portrayed, Khadgar being an obvious example. For some, seeing once unstoppable figures visibly changed by events reinforces the sense that Warcraft is now more focused on aftermath than invincibility. For others, it creates a kind of tonal dissonance in a world where magic has historically solved almost everything. And that tension is really what sits underneath the reaction. It's less about any one character and more about what Warcraft chooses to emphasize. Earlier eras often presented their heroes as mythic and untouchable. Modern Warcraft is more willing to show them altered by what they've survived. Whether that feels grounded or jarring depends entirely on what you want Warcraft's heroes to represent: escapist power fantasy, or the visible cost of everything they've endured. Another shift some players have picked up on is how certain modern cinematics are framed. Earlier Warcraft scenes often felt like private conversations between characters, moments that were rooted entirely within the world itself. Varian confronting Vol'jin after Garrosh's fall is a good example. The tension, the body language, the politics, it all feels like something unfolding inside Azeroth, not something being explained to the audience. Some more recent scenes are framed a little differently. At times, the dialogue feels less like characters speaking to each other and more like themes being expressed outward. Not always, and not across the board, but enough that some players feel the shift. And when that happens, the tone can come across as more instructional than immersive. Less like we're witnessing a moment in the world, and more like we're being told what that moment means. That doesn't necessarily make the themes weaker, but it does change how they land. Warcraft has always carried messages about war, power, and consequence. The difference is that earlier eras often embedded those ideas inside character conflict, while modern scenes sometimes place the message closer to the surface. And when tone moves from expression to explanation, some players read that as the game losing its edge, even when the underlying themes are just as heavy as they've always been. There are moments in modern Warcraft where this quieter approach falters, where scenes feel less like events unfolding naturally in the world and more like messages delivered outward. The Arathi Highlands storyline is a good example of this. The tension resolves almost immediately, and the characters stop reacting within the moment and begin articulating its lesson. The scene shifts from something we're watching unfold to something being explained. Even if you agree with the sentiment, the delivery changes how the moment lands. When a story stops trusting the world to carry its themes and begins stating them directly, some of the dramatic tension slips away. The result isn't that the message is wrong, it's that the weight of the scene feels lighter than it could have. Part of the backlash to this storyline comes from long memory. Characters like Danath Trollbane carry decades of established history. Wars fought, losses endured, grudges formed. So when a moment resolves quickly, or when long-held convictions soften almost instantly, some players experience that not as growth, but as dissonance. I think part of the disconnect comes down to something simple. We never really saw that change within Danath happen. The last time many players spent meaningful time with him, he was still defined by war and loss. His anger towards the orcs was never subtle, and it made sense given everything he'd lived through. So when he appears now in the War Within, older and more reflective, the destination itself isn't really the problem. It's that the journey there largely happened off-screen. We're told who he's become, rather than experiencing how he got there. And when a character's transformation isn't shown, when we don't sit with the events that softened them or the years that reshaped them, The shift can feel less like growth and more like replacement, and I'm not entirely against him changing. I just wish we'd seen the road that got him there. In storytelling, especially in a world this old, audiences want to walk the road with that character. They don't just want to be told where it leads. For them, it can feel less like a character reaching a hard-earned conclusion and more like the story arriving at one for them. And when that happens, the emotional weight of the moment can feel thinner than the history behind it. The world we've grown to know and love for years feels older, wounded, excavated rather than conquered. This expansion isn't about discovering new frontiers in the way earlier expansions were. It's about digging through what's already there. Forgotten histories, buried cities, and ancient scars beneath the surface. Older Warcraft often looked outward, toward the next invasion or the next enemy. The War Within looks inward, and that shift in perspective reinforces how the game's darkness has changed. It isn't just about what threatens the world anymore, it's about what the world has already been through. The War Within doesn't present a world that's lighter than before, it presents one that's carrying weight differently. Modern Warcraft is more interested in memory, consequence, and what survives after the battle ends. And that shift doesn't always land cleanly, but it does explain why the tone feels different. I think it's also worth touching on faction identity, because for some players, that's tied closely to tone. In The War Within, the spotlight leans heavily towards Alliance perspectives, while the Horde feel more like a supporting presence. That imbalance isn't new, but it's noticeable, especially since the shift to the Council structure, which still doesn't feel as defined or as mythic as the old Warchief era. And when faction identity fades, the world can feel less volatile. That doesn't necessarily mean the characters themselves are weaker or less compelling, but it does change the texture of the world when one side of its central conflict feels quieter than it once did. More on the faction war later in the video. Finally, before wrapping up this War Within section, there's one counter-argument I don't want to dodge because I think it's the strongest one. Some players actually don't think that WoW got softer at all, they think it just got worse at landing its darkness. Setting up tragedy is one thing, and paying it off is another. Modern WoW still reaches for heavy themes, but it sometimes resolves them too quickly, too cleanly, or with a twist that changes what the weight meant. When the ending doesn't carry the same gravity as the setup, people don't say, "That was poorly resolved." They say, "This feels Disney now." And that's not always a fair label, but I understand where it comes from. And once that sense of impact starts to slip, the words people reach for start to change. So now that we've walked through 20 years or so of World of Warcraft, I want to pause and talk about the words we use when we say that something feels off, because I don't think we're always pointing at the right thing. And there's one more reason this conversation has gotten louder in recent years, I think, and that's Classic WoW. And I'm not blaming Classic in any way. What I'm trying to say is Classic's return did a lot more than just reviving old content. It revived Warcraft's old texture. It let people step back into Warcraft's earlier rhythm, its harsher edges, its slower pace, and then immediately compare that feeling to modern delivery. And when you can swap between those two versions of the same world, the differences feel sharper than they ever did in real time. When people describe Warcraft as feeling more Disney-fied, they're rarely talking about the same thing. And that's part of the problem. The word gets used as a catch-all for frustration, and it's often paired with heavier language. Sanitized, soft, feminized, woke. Once the conversation reaches that point, it can become harder to talk about tone or storytelling clearly, because the discussion shifts away from the game itself and towards the wider internet conversation around it. The result is that Warcraft's actual tone gets lost, and everything gets flattened into a slogan. I don't think Disney-fied is really about who gets to be in the story or what identities are represented. Some point first to the brighter zones or cleaner visual presentation as the turning point, and I think those changes matter, but mostly because they reflect a broader shift in how Warcraft frames its stories, rather than being the cause of it. More often, it's about how conflict resolves. Older Warcraft stories were comfortable leaving things unresolved, uncomfortable, or openly hostile for long periods of time, and for some players, that shift changes how the stakes feel. The sharp edges are still there, but they're less likely to be allowed to cut, and that's part of what some players are reacting to. Earlier eras often let brutality, political tension, and moral ambiguity dominate entire expansions. Modern Warcraft tends to balance those elements more quickly. The darkness is still present, but it shares the stage more evenly, and for players who grew up with brutality dominating the frame, that balance can feel like dilution. When people say WoW feels defanged, I think they're often describing a change in what heroism looks like. Earlier Warcraft loved dominance. Conquer the zone, kill the villain, burn the banner, drop the mic. Modern Warcraft still has tragedy and violence, but it more often frames its characters through recovery, restraint, and aftermath. And if you grew up on Varian, Garrosh, Saurfang, and Arthas, that shift can feel like the edge is gone, even when the subject matter is still brutal. And sometimes, when players try to explain that missing edge, the conversation doesn't stay focused on tone or storytelling at all. It shifts towards who the story is about. It's also worth remembering that Warcraft has always centered powerful female characters. Illyria goes back to Warcraft 2. You have Tyrande, Jaina, Maiev, Sylvanas, Azshara. These aren't recent additions, and they were never controversial for most of the game's life. Personally, I really miss Varian and Garrosh. That gaping hole they left in the narrative hurts, but I want everyone kicking ass like that. Powerful, relevant characters of any gender, with the framing and payoff to match. Battle for Azeroth placed several women at the highest narrative level, and at the time, very few players framed that as a problem. The biggest noise I remember was the direction they were taking Sylvanas. What changed wasn't the presence of women, it was the environment around the conversation. Social media became faster, more polarised, and more incentivized to flatten nuance into outrage, and the conversation around games grew more reactive. So when someone says soft or defanged, I try to translate that. Are we talking about who is here, or the framing, payoff, and texture of the storytelling? A lot of people like to say that Warcraft is just not serious enough these days too, and as somebody who got involved with Warcraft as early as Warcraft 3, Warcraft has always been silly. From peons saying "work, work," to exploding sheep, kamikaze goblins, gnomes, and pop culture jokes or references. Even at what many consider Warcraft's darkest peak, Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard was doing things like this. This existed at the exact same time as Arthas, the Wrathgate, and Icecrown. Humour has been part of its DNA since forever. The problem isn't that the game suddenly discovered levity, it's that in more recent years, the balance between humour and gravity has shifted. Some point to changes after the 2021 lawsuit. Things like removed jokes, softened dialogue, and the loss of some crude humour as evidence that Warcraft lost its edge. And it's true that the game moved away from a lot of its old frat house energy, but removing crude or sexual innuendo doesn't remove actual darkness, tragedy, or consequence. Crudeness was never the same thing as edge or grit. It just changes what kind of discomfort the game is willing to indulge. So when people say Warcraft has gone soft, I don't think they're responding to representation, or even to the themes themselves. I think they're reacting to a change in tone, a world that feels more carefully presented, where darkness is still present, but rarely allowed to dominate the room. Another thing that sometimes gets folded into this idea that Warcraft has gone soft is the sense that characters don't die anymore. But if you look back, major character deaths were never especially common in Warcraft's earlier years, they just became very visible for a short period of time. Varian, Vol'jin, Tyrion, Saurfang. 4 huge moments in quick succession, and close enough to each other that they started to feel like a pattern. And once that pattern existed, it quietly created an expectation that death should be part of the story in a much bigger way than it ever really had been before. That doesn't mean the feeling is fake or wrong, it just means some of what people are reacting to is expectation as much as absence. Wanting stronger storytelling isn't always the same thing as wanting more characters to die. There's also another risk here. When too many major characters disappear, the world itself starts to feel smaller. Long-running settings rely on familiar figures returning, evolving, and colliding in new ways over time. Removing them permanently can close off stories rather than deepen them. I remember thinking ages ago that Sylvanas might return in Midnight and sacrifice herself to save Quel'Thalas, a full circle ending back to Warcraft 3, but now I find myself wondering whether I actually want that. Sylvanas, regardless of what people think of her after BFA and Shadowlands, is still one of the most tragic and compelling characters Warcraft has ever written. Do I really want her gone? Forever? Like so many others? More interestingly, when characters like Illidan and later Kael'thas and Vashj return years later, it raises the question of whether removing them permanently ever really strengthened the story in the first place. At the time, deaths like Kael'thas and Vashj made sense, of course. The Burning Crusade wasn't built around long character arcs in the same way Warcraft is today, and they were presented as villains after all. But Warcraft has a long history of bringing major characters back into the story. which suggests permanent removal has never really been its natural storytelling rhythm. Bringing characters back isn't always the right answer either, and sometimes the reaction isn't that characters aren't dying often enough, but that the wrong ones are. Vol'jin's death in particular left a lot of players feeling like a story had been cut short rather than completed. I don't see it as a problem in WoW personally that characters aren't dying enough. My bigger concern is whether the characters that remain are being used well. And I think one of the biggest issues is that Warcraft hasn't consistently introduced new mainstay characters with the same depth or attachment as the ones many players grew up with. That doesn't mean Blizzard shouldn't try and create new heroes, of course, but replacing old characters by removing them permanently isn't the same thing as evolving the cast. As mentioned earlier, Warcraft often explored grit through political tension and moral ambiguity. Faction leaders made questionable choices, wars escalated, great actors shaped the world in uncomfortable ways. Modern Warcraft externalizes evil more clearly, shifting conflict away from faction rivalry and towards existential threats or internal struggles. That doesn't mean the stakes are lower, but it does mean the texture of conflict feels different. It's clear that some people perceive war specifically as the faction war. There is no interest in the cosmic conflict, and there is some irony there because the beloved Lich King, Old Gods, and Burning Legion are inherently cosmic. That doesn't mean the feeling itself is fake, or that you're wrong for wanting the faction war. It means the language people use to describe it is often doing the thinking for them. When people say there's no war left in Warcraft, what they usually mean is that conflict is no longer presented as endless faction violence or spectacle-driven conquest. If your definition of war is banners clashing and cities burning every patch, then yeah, that version has quieted. But if war means consequence, identity fracture, inherited trauma, and characters living with what they've done, then the war never left. It internalized. It became generational trauma, ideological fracture, and the cost of power rather than banners and battlefields. There is a light versus void war taking place in Midnight right now. Warcraft hasn't stopped telling stories about strength, sacrifice, or failure. What's changed is how often those traits are expressed through domination and violence, versus restraint, responsibility, or loss. And maybe that's where Warcraft sits now. The question isn't whether darkness exists in modern Warcraft, it clearly does. Cities fall, heroes fracture, entire civilizations carry the weight of what came before them. The real difference is where the darkness lives. It lives less in the moment of destruction and more in what came after it. And that quieter kind of weight feels meaningful, but for others it feels like something essential has been lost. Which brings us back to the question at the centre of all of this. Not just whether Warcraft has gone soft, but what kind of darkness people are actually looking for. I need to say first of all, I'm not trying to convince anyone they're wrong for feeling the game has changed. I think the game has changed. I'm just trying to understand what we actually mean when we say it. I don't think the darkness ever really left Warcraft. I think it changed where it lives, and how loudly it speaks. Earlier eras wore their grit on the surface. Plague, fire, skulls, spectacle. If something was meant to feel grim, the game made sure you saw it. Modern Warcraft doesn't frame its horror that way as often. It's quieter, more internal, easier to overlook if you're not looking for it. That's why the soft WoW conversation keeps missing the mark. What changed isn't the presence of tragedy or consequence, it's the framing. The darkness didn't disappear, it just stopped shouting. At least that's how I see it. And if you feel differently, that's okay. This video isn't about telling anyone they're wrong. I just wanted to unpack what people mean when they say Warcraft has gone soft. But for me, I don't think World of Warcraft has gone soft, but it has aged into a different kind of storytelling. It traded the loud, heavy metal spectacle that defined its youth for quieter, more internal horrors. Some players will always prefer the screaming version, and there's nothing wrong with that. The real question, I think, isn't whether the darkness is still there, it's whether we're still willing to listen for it in a different key. There's also an uncomfortable reality beneath all of this. World of Warcraft can't stay frozen exactly as it was for the people who were there at the beginning. A living world has to keep welcoming new players alongside the ones who have been here for years, players without the same nostalgia or expectations. And that doesn't mean abandoning its identity, it means translating it, and translation always changes tone. Some of the players who once stayed up until 3 AM wiping on Illidan or Arthas now have families. A 20-year-old online world doesn't survive without evolving. Very few MMOs ever reach this point at all. Change isn't a betrayal of its identity, it's the reason it's still here. That doesn't automatically mean it's softer, it means it's trying to survive. So maybe the real question isn't, has WoW gone soft? It's, what do you mean by grit? If darkness only counts when it's loud, then maybe what changed isn't Warcraft, it's what we're listening for. If you've made it all the way to the end, thank you so much. This video comes from a place of loving this world, this game, and wanting to understand why it feels different now, and whether that difference is as simple as, it went soft, or something more complicated than that. Warcraft has meant a lot to many of us for a really long time, and I imagine that's why you're watching this video. So what do you think? Do you need the heavy metal spectacle to feel it, or are you still listening for the quieter horrors underneath? Whether you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. A huge thank you to my supporters on Patreon, your encouragement helps me keep making these videos. If you'd like to support the channel, there's a link in the description. And a special thanks to Pyromancer for some great discussions about Dragonflight and the War Within that helped shape some of the ideas in this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.